Hi, and welcome to the Urban Tech VC, a podcast for urban leaders shaping the cities of tomorrow. If you love our show, do drop us a review, share it with your friends, and follow 2BX on LinkedIn or Instagram. Today, we're happy to welcome Lea, co-founder of Posmo Cooperative and senior analyst of data and AI ethics at Thomson Reuters. Lea is passionate about digital ethics and sustainable mobility. If you're an urban tech founder about to raise a round, do reach out to us. We'd love to connect and see if we should play together. Are you tired of always hearing about Silicon Valley VCs and not knowing what the greats of European VC are thinking? Well, no more. Head on over to eu.vc, the go-to place for everything European VC. You'll find podcasts, events, and expert-curated content from all over the EU VC scene. Well, what are you waiting for? Go to eu.vc.
Hey, Lea, and welcome to our podcast. We're so excited to have you at the Urban Tech VC today.
Hi. Yeah, it's a really big pleasure to be here and talk to you about what we're doing here in Switzerland. Not too far, but also not right around the corner from Berlin, I think.
Yeah, from Berlin, almost everything feels super far away. That's true. So, Lea, first of all, we want to dive into who you are. So you work as data ethicist for a software corporate, but you're also board member for Posmo. Posmo is a cooperative for mobility data. And this might spark some questions here and there. So it would be awesome if you could explain what exactly does a data ethicist do in their daily business and how this relates to your job as board member.
So data ethics, or sometimes we also speak about digital ethics more broadly, is a rather new area. It really looks at sort of how does the way we use data, we collect data, influence individuals, but also society as a whole. And what an ethicist always cares about are the sort of moral implications. So sort of what values might be influenced or what sort of moral ideals that we have as a society that are in our legal system, that are in the way we interact with each other just on our day-to-day basis. And how is that changing through the way we collect data and use that. So that's all very high level. And so what do we do in our day-to-day? So a lot of the things is really trying to bridge the technology side with this more high-level values side. So we often hear about things like transparency or privacy. And so what we as digital ethicists do is to think, well, what does it actually mean if we say we want to have a transparent way of dealing with data? What does that mean for the users? What does that mean for the people developing technology, for the people using data? And so you really try to implement these more high-level concepts in technical solutions, procedural solutions. Not always we have a technical solutions for some of these questions. For example, we look at automated decision-making systems and we think of, do we really want this to be fully automated, or are decisions so important that we need some sort of human involvement? How can this look like from a procedural point of view, but then also how does the interface have to look like so that the human decision makers actually can make good decisions with the help of automated decision-making technology?
I have a prompt follow-on question here. What is a task in your daily doing that you absolutely love and one task that annoys you?
I love the exchange with the developers. So we speak a lot with data scientists, and they obviously, their job is to develop rather complex algorithms and look at those and try to sort of make predictions, for example, make these algorithms perform a function in a product or also in a sort of internal use case. And then we come and we say, well, but we want you to consider fairness in that algorithm. And then the people are like, oh, well, what do you mean? Tell me. What does it mean? What do I have to do? I mean, if they agree that fairness should be something considered, they're like, okay, tell me what to do. And then the really interesting and also difficult part starts. Okay, so what does it actually mean? And what is even possible? And how can we support the data scientists in sort of considering fairness, in identifying bias or things alike?
from the technology perspective that you're addressing, right? So there are different things. You have real artificial intelligences where you basically have a black box where it is very difficult to figure out how decisions are actually made. And then you have this kind of like algorithms, right, where you can determine the parameters more or less, but it's not self-learning and not real artificial intelligence. What is your take on that? Are you working with both technologies at the moment, or do you have a preference for one when you look at the consulting projects that you're doing or the work that you do at Posmo when it comes to data ethics?
I tend to try to avoid this discussion of what is actually AI and speak about, sometimes say algorithms or models, because I think in the end, sort of the type of technique you use to build out your algorithm, if it's machine learning or deep learning, it obviously has an impact on sort of downstream, but it also doesn't change what you want to achieve. So I think I try to stay away from that, both at Posmo and also in my other function. We have different types of models. And often I think the discussion is partially about what does actually the model do, and is there bias within the model, and can we sort of identify that, mitigate that? But a lot of it, especially from the ethics point of view, is also on processes and sort of thinking, kind of embedding these concepts from the beginning and throughout the architecture of any product. So, for example, transparency. This is something that is very important to us at Posmo. We say that this is core, that we must ensure transparency of what type of data we're collecting, we're also sort of managing as a cooperative, and then also how it is used. And we're thinking right now of how can we build a feature that informs individual users of what their data is being used for downstream. So what are the projects that are using their data from a large data pool, and sort of what their data is sort of being used to change also then from the more client side.
You said something very interesting, a very interesting word in that context with regards to Posmo. You said cooperative. So let's touch a little bit upon that and the business model behind it. And I'll give you a little bit of context from my point of view, right? Since I started my professional career, there has always been this saying, and I'm quite aware that this saying has been out there for decades now, that data is the new gold, right? So that implies there is a business model attached, or there are several business models attached to data, and that data is becoming more and more valuable. And we know that, right? If you're looking at the GAFA companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, those companies basically rely on data a lot. You chose a cooperative to roll out your view and your product with Posmo, and not kind of like going fully into this gold digging rush or gold mining rush, so to speak, because cooperative is slightly different, how it works and operates and whom it benefits, right? If I'm not mistaken. So maybe you can dive a little bit deeper into why you choose a cooperative, how it differs, what drove your decision towards setting Posmo up in this particular form. How's it been so far, and what are your key learnings and do's and don'ts?
Okay, a lot of things to touch on. I'll try to cover them all. So Posmo, which is short for Positive Mobility, is a data cooperative for mobility data. You mentioned that. And so our sort of main goal is to build a radically new data-driven business model with that cooperative aspects, which puts the ethical governance of its data at the center of what we do. So we really want to see, is it possible to have a model where not few individuals have immense control over data and can decide, not only reap the benefits of data they have collected from other people or other individuals, but also can decide basically what happens with it. So we want to build a model where individuals have control and can decide collectively about what should happen to the data they're all contributing. We've always, from the beginning, said we have two goals. The first one is to actually make data available that is not available today for a variety of reasons that we can maybe touch on later. So we want to create very high quality mobility data sets that then can be used by public administrations, by research, to actually understand mobility better, to plan mobility better. So that's our one aim. And the other one is the one I just mentioned, which is, can we build a model where the individual data producers, as we like to call them, they don't just give their data in return for a product, but they can actually, on one hand, control what is being done with their data, but then also collectively reap the benefits, financial benefits in the end from that data.
If I can take control individually about my data, right, in this pool. Does that not compromise the data set, so to speak? Because if everybody, let's say we have 100 data points each that we give into Posmo, right? And I decide to only give away 20, you decide to give away 20 but totally different data points, and so on and so on. Does that not compromise? Like if you want to utilize the data for the whole group, does that not compromise the data set or the product in a certain way?
That's a very good point. You spotted one of the issues that we have had, or that were clear from the beginning. So how do we deal with it? That we want to build a pool, and that is only valuable as a pool of data. Nobody cares how I personally move around the city, right? Probably. I would hope
if you
so.
stalk a good, but
no stalkers yet.
No stalkers yet. But what people care about is how a lot of people move around and trying to identify patterns, right? And so my individual data is not that interesting. I mean, I'm sure there can be value attached to that as well, through advertisement or whatsoever, but it's more interesting to have that group. So we want to build a pool. And then we have that problem where we say, well, we want to give people control over their data. And so we're trying to find this middle way. And what we've decided is that we assume a sort of general consent when people participate in Posmo, when people use the apps that we provide to track themselves. And then we have an intermediary, which is our ethics counsel. And I think we'll touch upon it later some more. And the Ethics Council sort of represents the individuals and is responsible to ensure that the data is used in line with the interests of the collective, but that also the interests of the individuals are protected. And so we have this intermediary group of people or institution that controls that access. But it's something that we're still trying to figure out, how we can give people as much control as possible without having this negative side effect of, well, if everyone sort of has to always decide on yes, no, then we'll never get a pool that is interesting enough to be usable.
Very interesting approach that you're choosing here. You are fully transparent about what the ethics committee does to all of your users, or are there certain, let's say, black spots, so to speak, where you're not that transparent?
I think I've mentioned it before. Transparency is, I think, one of the key elements, and we are still building out sort of these processes of how does the Ethics Council actually decide on what projects are made with this common data pool. But it'll surely all be made public, and also trying to see how we can build mechanisms to give people their say in how this process plays out, what are the criteria to decide on. So this is all sort of work in progress, but always with the intent to make that transparent so that everyone can understand how it plays out.
How did you come up with the decision to choose the model cooperative? Was it a hard decision, or was it an easy decision because you're super aligned on that core element, transparency, for example? Was it a low-brainer for you?
The idea of the cooperative, I wasn't the one that came up with it. So I can't say what the initial idea was. It was from the moment I got involved, it sort of turned around this idea. But I guess maybe one thing to mention is that cooperatives historically have been quite important here in Switzerland. We have them, they play a very important role in the housing sector, but also sort of some in the agricultural sector and these areas. So it's a very old, I would say, organizational form or business model. And the idea at the core is really to pool individual resources and be able to build something bigger or create something bigger. So that always was the idea as well, to try that out with data. So if we pool our individual data, we can create a data pool that is more interesting. That was kind of the origin of it. And then the cooperative has a couple of features, I would say, that are interesting to us. On one hand, it's fundamentally democratic because everyone has their say. So every member of the cooperative has an equal amount of decision power of sort of who gets elected to the Ethics Council, for example, but also just decide on what happens with the cooperative. So it's really this like one person, one vote kind of situation. And then the cooperative has this idea of also mutualizing the benefits that come out of it, where not two people that have invested much more than others like get a much higher part of their shares, but really trying to sort of mutualize the financial benefit that might come out of this data in the medium and long term. So I think these two elements were really important to us when deciding on that model.
A big argument when we discuss the value of data and the question how to monetize it is that when you look at the big, again, if you look at GAFA, if you look at Google or anything, the big argument is, look, the fact that you can use Google Maps without paying is a result of giving away your data. right? So you already get a lot of benefit out of it, right? So how do you differ in your model and your approach, and what would be your take on that? Because there is an argument that says, okay, look, we already monetize a lot on our personal data.
So I guess the monetization at this moment in the models you've described is through advertising, right? So you basically share a lot of your data, and how Google or Facebook or all these companies, how they make their money is by selling ads based on your personal information. What we do differently is that we provide a tracking service for mobility, so tracking basically through a mobile app, but that isn't paid by the individual users, but is paid for by organizations that are actually interested in this type of data. And so who we're targeting specifically is research institutes that run research projects and need access to that data, but also public administrations that want to have more specific insights. And so they pay Posmo to run a project that collects data, and we administer all that data for them. We provide them with a product that they can track with the people they want to target. And so that is the core business model on one side. And then on the other side, obviously, once people want to use data that is in our data pool, they pay us a fee to access that data. And so that's sort of the two ways how we try to monetize this at the moment.
Now that we dived into the topic of data and cooperative, I would like to come to mobility and sustainable way of mobility, what this means for you personally, for Posmo, and what role data actually does play in helping cities to achieve the important change there.
So I think mobility or sustainable mobility for me has a couple of aspects to it. So on one hand, I think it must be climate neutral. And I think this is the way we're sort of heading, right, to reduce or minimize the effect on the climate that we have with our mobility behavior. It needs to be efficient, needs to do its job. It doesn't, like, we could all start walking and ban everything else, but that wouldn't be very efficient, right? It needs to be equitable. So we need to have mobility solutions that don't only work for privileged people in dense urban areas, but also work for underprivileged people that might live in more rural areas or in areas that are less served by public transport. So these are three elements that I think are very important from that side. And you asked about the role data plays. I think it plays an essential role. I mean, we know a lot about mobility behavior, but it's a social phenomenon. It changes a lot. We can see the pandemic has changed massively how people move across the city, home office. These trends weren't like 5 years ago. That just wasn't really a thing. And now we know that people, they commute differently. They display very different mobility behavior. So I think we'll continuously have to invest in research. And in order to do research, we need data.
Would you say that most of the options that we have right now when it comes to mobility are still suffering severe underutilization?
I mean, I think I'm not a mobility expert. I know you had a recent podcast episode with somebody that is actually a mobility planner, so I'm not going to dive too deep. I come more from the data ethics side. But yes, I think we have a problem that we have underutilization during some phases of the day, and then we have very highly utilized resources. I mean, public transport, but also roads during certain times of the day, the typical commuting hours. And I think that's a problem that a lot of urban, but even rural areas face.
Data can solve the utilization problem. I mean, this is obviously the road I wanted to go here, right? And you're feeding right into that. But can you give our listeners an easy example on what data they would have to give away or would have to give away in order to even be able to build something, to build a model, or to build an offering that can solve the utilization issue? And you do not have to touch upon too much about the correctness of the data points to solve the utilization issue, but rather on an idea what data I would have to give away.
So, I mean, there's different approaches to that utilization issue. One is mobility pricing. It's something that a couple of cities, London, for example, have implemented for some years. In Switzerland, it's a very hotly debated topic, like making drivers pay more during rush hour. I think that's the sort of main use case here for now. It's like discussions have happened for public transport as well. But so if people want to drive into the center of London during certain hours of the day, they have to pay to do that. And this mobility pricing obviously depends on sort of knowing who actually drives to London at what time. And you can collect this information by very different means. You can put cameras that sort of scan license plate, but you could also use GPS points, kind of having individual accounts where you use tracking, like GPS tracking. And that's the path we're going with. Posmo is saying GPS is a very fantastic technology. It doesn't only allow us to navigate as we use it often through the city, but it also obviously allows us to infer a lot of information on not only from where to where somebody goes, but also with what speed, how fluent is that journey. And you can do that for cars, obviously, it's been around for a long time, but you can also do that for bikes or even for pedestrians. And that is something where we're focusing very strongly on, not so much on public transport or cars, but really trying to bridge a data gap that exists for the, in French, they call it the mobilité douce, so the soft mobility modes like pedestrians, for example, so walking, but also biking. And I think this was also at the beginning of Posmo, is realizing that we do have mobility data in different levels of quality, but it focuses very, very strongly on cars and public transport and very little on these other modes. And maybe just one anecdote, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, the German Chancellor invited for an annual mobility summit in Germany, right? And in that mobility summit, the only mobility form that was covered was basically cars. The understanding of mobility, I mean, there was a lot of public outcry from the sort of biking community because everyone said, we're in 2023, you organize a huge event on mobility, representative for the whole government, and the only industry you invite is the car industry. And that just shows at what point we still are when we speak about mobility. And I think that's where, as Posmo, we want to really dive in, is say we need more data on other mobility modes, because that's where we have huge gaps. And we need that in order to create sustainable mobility systems in the future.
Something that we're looking at a lot, and that is an urban context, obviously, is the question, how much do we even need to move, right? Are we not moving way too much, right? Us as people, but also goods and services that we have, do they not require way too much travel? Do you have any insights or any take on this topic? Have you looked at some of these issues or the question, or is that something that is within the Posmo scope? Like, how can you reduce movement, actually?
I think personally, that's a super interesting topic. My father, who's not at all in that business, has talked about that for a long time. So I think from him and discussions I've had with him, this topic has always been on my mind. So are we not overly mobile, right? Is mobility in the end is also a sort of form of consumption, and isn't it too much? And in theory, I totally agree. Personally, practically, I find it very hard. I love to be mobile. Like, I love to move around, not only the city, but also I love to see my friends abroad. I try to travel as much by train as possible, but it only works to a certain degree. Overseas is more complicated. And so I think this is a topic that we'll have to start discussing. I think we're still rather far away if we think of sort of coming back to that mobility summit focusing on cars. I think the discussion eventually will have to turn that way. I think realistically, we're still at a place where the majority of people that work in the sector are sort of looking, or also public administrations are looking of how to increase infrastructure. I think we're still building more and more roads. We're expanding roads. We're trying to build more railways, better public transport. And so I think it's an important decision. And I believe that also with the type of data that we're collecting, we're administrating at Posmo, we'll be able to contribute to that discussion once sort of it's ready to be had.
Just coming back to the mobility is the same as car. Wrong attitude here. It's not really surprising that the CO2 emissions couldn't be reduced since 1990 in the mobility sector based on that. And if you look at the stats in Germany, it's only 20%, about 20% of passenger transport was done by sustainable means, cycling, public transport. So it really doesn't surprise at all if we talk about mobility in that context. But I would like, before we come to the next topic, talking more about data ethics, I would like to get one or two projects you do with Posmo. Perhaps the one in Zurich you mentioned when we talked for the first time was about data donations, or anything else you want to share, but that would be cool too.
Yeah, I'm happy to share a little bit about that. So we have a pilot project running with the city of Zurich since August. And so when I say the city of Zurich, I mean the sort of administration, the public administration. And the idea or the big question that we are trying to answer is what motivates people to donate their mobility data for the public interest. And I know public interest can mean a lot of things, but we didn't define it at that point more narrowly. And we're working, as I mentioned, with the city administration. We're also working with the University of Zurich and other partner organizations in that project, because we really have this approach of this sort of scientific approach as well, not only scientific in terms of what can be read out of the data we're collecting, but also sort of understanding people's attitudes towards their personal data and towards making it available. And so the city of Zurich from the beginning said, well, we don't want to have that data, right? Because it's the data on where I spend every minute of my day. And the public administration was very aware and said, if we start as the public administration to collect this type of data, people will say, well, this is like state surveillance and all of these things. And again, they're not interested in individuals, they're interested in larger patterns. So they said, we're going to work with Posmo, who is a sort of intermediary here, to collect this data for us. And our job is to collect it, to aggregate it, and to anonymize it, and then make it available for very specific questions that different parts of the administration have. And at the same time, we're sort of trying to understand the user side. So what actually motivates people to donate data, what different causes we've experimented with different messages. So trying to see if people are more willing to donate data for climate causes or for bike causes, if we frame the project more from the biking perspective or from the climate perspective. And so we're really trying to learn about what motivates people. And this is not completely new. Other research projects have looked at these factors before, but we're doing it now on like very specifically for us. And then maybe just in terms of what use cases the city wants to answer, I think that's interesting, maybe. So they're really trying to understand the last mile. So the public transport organization wants to understand, well, they have quite some data on sort of who uses what means of transport, not who, but they kind of know like which lines are used more frequently and what times and stuff, but they don't know what happens once a person leaves the bus or the tram. And so they kind of want to get a better understanding of this last mile, and they can use that information, for example, to optimize locations of public transport stops. That's a more medium long-term goal, but also even for like just understanding sort of what frequencies these services should be run. Are people waiting for a long time? And on the other hand, we are focusing on the biking infrastructure and trying to sort of get a better understanding of high frequency routes to improve infrastructure at these points more specifically.
You now again mentioned a very important example, right? You said, this is state surveillance, right? So what we can observe generally is that there is a fear when it comes to giving away data, interestingly, particularly to the state, right? We are not afraid of giving our data to Facebook, to Google. But if we want to optimize traffic or mobility, then we're afraid that the state knows too much about us, right? This is a mindset thing. But that also relates to the ethics aspect, right? And the question, is there transparency? Do we know what is done with our data and what not? I think personally that there is a certain fear implemented in society in general, because we already learned that algorithms can be discriminating, right? There are very interesting examples from the US where algorithms have been used in court law, and they have been discriminating because the data sets already were discriminating. Right, looking at the past. So what is your take? Like, I mean, obviously it is important to imply data ethics by any means, but what is your take on that? How do you actually do that? How do you prevent algorithms, or like for the majority of society, basically black boxes, right, to discriminate and what are good and what are bad ethics?
Okay, the discrimination, or maybe first one comment to your comment on privacy. I think it's interesting because we obviously have that part of society that is very privacy aware, and doesn't want to give data away. But I think there are also a lot of people that don't care. And I think that's important to realize as well. I don't know if they probably should care, but they don't. And they say, I have nothing to hide. And I think this is a very prevalent way. And then there's the middle that say, well, I kind of care, but I love the products too much and I can't be bothered in my day-to-day. And I think so different personas in that privacy sphere. And the second part of your question was more on how can we ensure fairness or avoid discrimination from algorithms or from the data. And I previously talked about the fact that there is much less data on these soft mobility modes. And I think an important factor when we talk about discrimination is that you can see that different social demographic groups have very different mobility behavior. And for example, we have a huge data, like a gender data gap in many areas, but also in mobility, because women across the world tend to use public transport more and also tend to have a smaller circle of activity. So they tend to walk more, tend to bike, I'm not sure, but walking for sure. And so if we have less data on walking, we immediately also have less data on women. And I think that's a huge issue. And you asked how we're trying to solve it, not only the problem, but what we're trying to do. So we're very aware of this. And besides the sort of mobility data, we also collect social demographic data on people, because without that, the data is really not that interesting. And not because we want to identify people, but it's just important to know what groups of people of society have what mobility behavior. And so we really try to, from the beginning, make sure that if we run analysis, that we run them sort of broken down for genders, ideally also for age groups. We don't have data on income, but that would also obviously be an interesting factor. And then you can look at different geographics and sort of see if there's also differences. So I think we're very aware of that in that way. Further down the road, once this data can be used for really models to do predictions or the things you mentioned, I think with the knowledge that we already have in-house with our ethics council, we'll be well prepared to also immediately run bias detection, bias mitigation efforts on these algorithms.
Could one argue that at the end, you're determining your ideal world, right? So how it should look like from the perspective of your ethics committee? That's the question of democratization, right? So what if the majority wants to be discriminated? I'm being a little bit provocative here. How does the ethics committee determine what is fair and what not, right?
I mean, in that sense, so we're gathering data, we're administrating data, managing data, but we're not creating the use cases, right? So I think the ethics committee is not going to say this is a fair mobility system or this is not a fair mobility system. What we will say is if you run this type of analysis, you should be aware of social demographic factors, and this is how you can make them apparent in that data. Or if you have a specific subset of our data and there's only one woman and 50 men, then that's obviously a problem. Like, I think the role of the ethics committee in that situation is more to raise awareness on this and to also show limitations of the data and sort of the inferences that can be made with that data.
Would you say, Lea, every company dealing with data, so probably every company, should have that kind of committee?
The easy answer would be yes. I'm not sure that's actually realistic. I'm also a very pragmatic person. So I think it makes sense when organizations deal with very sensitive data. And this is what we have in our case, right? We have very, very high resolution data on where people are, and you can read so many things out of that. So I think in our case, when we speak about this individual mobility data, GPS data, we need to have checks and balances in place to make sure this is not abused and this is not used by whomever for like identifying people for sort of adversarial causes. And our ethics council is the checks and balances that we've built sort of on an institutional level, but also on the content level to really ensure that our data ethics principles are embedded in our technology, but also really ensure that we have these checks and balances in the processes that we're building out on who can use our data, defining from the beginning criteria on sort of what the data can be used for, how it can be used. And this is really the work we're doing at this moment, is trying to define all of this to build processes that are on one hand scalable, automatic, but also have this human aspect to it where we have the approval. We need the approval of the ethics council to be able to make our data available to third parties. And so this is core functions. And I think having this function for organizations that deal with very sensitive data will become an imperative and is becoming more and more important also as more regulation in that space is coming.
One follow-on question, sensitive data, GPS data you mentioned. Is there any other kind of data that you would highlight or mark as very sensitive for all those founders out there dealing with data?
As I mentioned, we also collect socio-demographic data. That's obviously also sensitive data in its form. But I think in the health sector, this is a sector that we know very much also deals with extremely sensitive data. And actually, the first data cooperative in Switzerland is a data cooperative that was built for health data. So interesting also to have that concept in that space.
Would you be like an advocate, or would you say, okay, everyone that is a member of the cooperative should be able to use the data regardless which use case this member is building? Or should there be a control who can access the data and what for?
No, I definitely think there needs to be control also for the members. So basically, any Swiss resident can become member of the cooperative. For a more legal reason, I think people need to live in Switzerland to become members. And so you wouldn't want just by sort of becoming a member, and that really doesn't require that much, that people have easy access to this data or that our checks and balances wouldn't be in place. So even if people want to access it that are a member of the cooperative, they still need to undergo this process because, you never know what their intentions are and what they might do with it.
Lea, unfortunately, we have to come to an end, but we have one last thing to do. It's our quick fire round, 10 questions. It's more a yes or no. So try to not choose an in-between here and there. Are you ready for that?
Yes, totally.
Perfect. So first question, rural or urban?
Urban.
Cycling or walking?
Cycling.
Open data or closed data?
Open.
Environmental or social impact?
Social.
Plane or train?
Train.
Taking a risk or playing safe?
Playing safe.
Cooperative or traditional business?
Well, that's an easy one. Cooperative, of course.
App or pen and paper?
App.
Amsterdam or Barcelona?
Amsterdam.
Mountains or ocean?
Ocean, but also mountains.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We had a great time. I hope you had a great time as well. It was a very insightful episode, I think. So again, thank you very much for taking the time, and hope to see you soon in person and continue the discussion.
Thanks to both of you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Urban Tech VC, a podcast for urban leaders shaping the cities of tomorrow. If you love our show, do drop us a review, share it with your friends, and follow 2BX on LinkedIn or Instagram. And if you are about to raise a round, drop us a note at LinkedIn or via email at idea@2bx.vc. Let's have a talk and see where we can help. Are you tired of always hearing about Silicon Valley VCs and not knowing what the greats of European VC are thinking? Well, no more. Head on over to eu.vc, the go-to place for everything European VC. You'll find podcasts, events, and expert-curated content from all over the EU VC scene. Well, what are you waiting for? Go to eu.vc.